Welcome to review session 13. We are talking about extra embryonic membranes, and you'll recall last review session then we ended up by talking about the chorion and the development of the chorion and its role in the development of the placenta. And just to finish up with that information, recall then that in addition to having this function of exchanging materials that we talked about last time, exchanging materials between the two bloodstreams, between the maternal and the fetal bloodstream, the placenta also then, recall, produces the hormone progesterone. And so with this, we're moving on now and talking about a second extra embryonic membrane, the amnion. You may want to turn back to page 879. Take a quick look at the top of the page at figure 2310 and just remind yourself of the location of the amnion with respect to the other extra embryonic membranes and with respect to the embryo. And so two then, your lecture outline, and number two, amnion, and just looking over that information and going through this very quickly, the amnion then develops deep to the chorion. Also, the amnion, like the chorion, also surrounds the embryo. And keep in mind then, in terms of embryonic development, you'll recall that within the blastocyst, and this doesn't have to go all into your notes again, but you'll recall then, if you think back to the blastocyst and what the blastocyst looks like, you'll recall the blastocyst is this hollow ball of cells containing within it this clump of stem cells called the inner cell mass. And you'll recall at some point during embryonic development, this clump of cells, the clumped inner cell mass, transforms into a flat structure, a disc-like structure called the embryonic disc. And this happens, you'll remember, again, doesn't have to go back into your notes, but this transformation, you'll remember, happened shortly after implantation. But now, if you go back to figure 2310, you'll notice that at this point, we're much further along in development. And so that embryonic disc has now developed, remember, into a gastrula stage. And in turn, the gastrula stage then has, again, by the time we get to the point that we're seeing in figure 23.10, the gastrula has developed substantially more in terms of growth and development of the embryo itself. And so again then, back to your lecture outline for amnion. Within the amnion, recall then, there's a fluid called amniotic fluid filling the amniotic cavity. And this amniotic fluid, again, just reading along in your lecture outline, just reminding ourselves then, this amniotic fluid provides a space where the embryo can grow freely at a stable temperature. Also very important, this amniotic fluid provides a protective cushion around the developing embryo. And then finally, a portion of the umbilical cord forms from the amnion. Moving along in your lecture outline then, a third extra embryonic membrane, remember, is the yolk sac. And again, you can take a quick look at figure 23.10 and just remind yourself of the position of the yolk sac attached to the underside of the embryo. And in terms of functions then, the yolk sac produces blood cells, produces cells that later become sex cells, forms the digestive tube, and forms part of the umbilical cord. And then finally, to the fourth extra embryonic membrane, to the allantois. Again, you can see that structure in figure 23.10. And the allantois then produces blood cells and forms the umbilical blood vessels. Moving on then, and talking about these so-called primary germ layers. And here you might want to flip back to page 878, figure 23.9, and recall then that these primary germ layers consist of the ectoderm, the endoderm, and the mesoderm. And here again, you don't need to put it back into your notes at this point, but just recall the process by which we get these three primary germ layers. And so we begin, remember, with that flat structure called the embryonic disc. And then you'll recall through a kind of growing together and diving down process, growing toward one another and then diving down and then spreading back out, we go from a single layer of cells to two layers of cells, and then as this diving and spreading process continues, we go to three layers of cells, and you'll recall then that the initial layer that we start with remains as the ectoderm. The layer that develops underneath, the second layer to develop, is the endoderm. And then finally, the third layer, which develops in between the ectoderm and the endoderm, is the mesoderm. And back to your lecture outline then. And so among the functions of these three different layers of cells, among these three primary germ layers, the ectoderm gives rise to the nervous system and the integumentary system. The endoderm to the lining of the digestive and respiratory systems, and the mesoderm, among other structures, gives rise to muscles and bones. And that concludes the information on the fetal stage of development. And so that concludes then development through the first 8 weeks of prenatal development, through the first 8 weeks of pregnancy. And at this point, we call the developing structure a fetus rather than an embryo. So embryonic stage again lasts for the first 8 weeks, and subsequent to this first 8 weeks, we then have the fetal stage of development. And that is as far as we are going in chapter 23.